Okay, I think the numbers come in. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for taking the time today, and taking time out of your day to actually sit in for today's webinar. We're excited. We have an amazing lineup. And so just to start, I'd want to give a very simple intro about the Academy for those of you who may not know. So the Academy is a rule of law charity that carries the aim of promoting the rule of law and governance across the continent of Africa. We do this especially through having such conversations and ideally just being a knowledge base and a sort of think tank where we just convene thoughts on different issues that are facing Africa with the goal of ensuring that both the professional side, the governance side, and the public are better educated. They have a better understanding of their rights and are better and are equipped with the tools that they need to be able to show up in the very best way. And so at this time, I'd like to hand it over to our moderator of the day, who is Rutendo Nyaku, who is going to introduce our panelist, and we'll get right into the discussion. Just a few housekeeping rules. At any point, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box just at the bottom of your screen, and we will ask those questions and include them at the end. Though towards the end of this discussion, we will also give an opportunity for people who would like to ask their questions in person to be able to do that. And so at that time, just please raise your hand and we will be able to sort of usher in. But I think we'd really encourage as many of you to ask and engage with us in the chatbot. So please enjoy. And I hope you leave having learned something new. So, Rutendo?
Thanks, Eva. I hope everyone can hear me. Welcome to our webinar on reputation, recovering your reputation. After following investigations and forensics. Okay, so my name is Rutendo Nyaku. I'm the Rule of Law Advisor at ALN Academy. My job really here is to just bring out the multiple perspectives that we have from speakers. And so I'd just like to welcome our speakers formally, Nikita, Vili, Moses, and Aisha, who bring with them a depth, a wide depth and breadth of experience, particularly in reputation management, disputes resolution, litigation, as well as forensics and investigations. So to start off, I'll just give you a little bit of a background in terms of what it is that we are discussing today. So today's discussion is beginning with the tension at the heart of the rule of law. As we, as Zephyr has told you, our mission at ALN Academy is essentially to promote and advance the rule of law. But sometimes in advancing the rule of law, reputations are damaged, or things don't always happen procedurally in the most correct way, in such a way that it actually damages public trust. So investigations, litigation, and regulatory action are necessary, yes, and allegations must be examined, institutions must be accountable, and wrongdoing must be addressed. But at the same time, the fact that a person or an organization is being investigated can also become its own public judgment. As Nikita will probably tell you, it can take a life of its own beyond the legal and regulatory system. The law asks whether an allegation can be proved through a fair process. Reputation, on the other hand, is formed differently, and it is shaped by real time by headlines, search results, social media, stakeholder reactions, as well as incomplete information. And so that means the legal and the reputational timelines often move at different speeds and with varying levels of implications and consequences. So one of the examples that we have used is the example of Dizani Alison Madueke, one of the first female presidents managing oil in Nigeria, who was investigated for fraud for over 13 years. It was a UK investigation. It then landed up in an acquittal. However, in these 13 years, her reputation has been significantly damaged, and it means that it's impossible for her to get into circles that she once was part of. And so, as we use the case of Alison Madueke, to begin our conversation, we will be asking we'll be asking various questions of our panelists to try and understand what happened, what could happen in future if you are an organization or a person who finds themselves in a particular situation. We'll also be hearing from our renowned disputes lawyers, Moses and Aisha, exactly from the rule of law perspective, what we should be doing. Billy will come into the conversation with all of his experience in forensics and investigations to help us understand what best practices should look like. Should you find yourself in a situation like this, or should you find yourself interacting with an investigator of some kind for any particular reason? What are the questions you should be having in your mind? What exactly should you be knowing about these kinds of approaching? So please join me in welcoming our speakers of the day. We're really, really excited to hear from you. I'm excited to hear from you too. I have an organization that needs management, but yes, truly, truly welcome. So the way we'll begin our conversation is to first start with standards during an investigation to at least try to understand. And so the question that I will pose to all of my speakers, and we'll begin our responses with Billy, is what fairness, proportionality, confidentiality, and due process standards should apply before wrongdoing is established? Billy, perhaps you can open us off.
Thank you, Rutendo. Good afternoon, everyone. As Rutendo said, my name is Willie Olofse. I'm leading the forensic risk and compliance team. And I do think it's important just to give a little bit of context. I've been doing investigations for almost 30 years, and that's across the continent, based in Nairobi, Kenya. But we've been probably to 15 countries on the continent the last year. So from an investigative perspective, this is a very real and significant risk. In our work, investigations often involve very senior individuals and institutions that includes board members, CEOs, CFOs, and the allegations are normally of a serious nature. We're dealing with fraud, bribery, corruption, harassment. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a significant increase in allegations of sexual harassment, and we can just think about the reputational risk around some of these topics, and abuse of power is also relatively common. The key point I would like to make at the outset is an investigation is not a search for confirmation or suspicion. It's a search for the truth. And I think the most important thing for me when organizations are looking for independent professional investigators, I think that's probably the key, the key to find people that are qualified, find people that are experienced, because we are dealing with people's lives, livelihoods, and careers. So in terms of standards, the first standard is professional independence and objectivity. Investigators carry out significant responsibility because the process itself can affect careers, like I said, livelihood and reputation. Before any findings, the investigator's role is not to appear powerful or important. It is to plan, investigate properly, identify and preserve evidence, analyze its objectively, and then very important, connecting the dots and report independently. And I'll say a bit more about that. The second standard is fairness, procedurally. The subject of concern should, at the appropriate stage, understand the allegations, and be given the meaningful opportunity to respond. We see this in practice all the time, where people are not given the opportunity to actually provide justification for potential wrongdoing. And then when you look at it in more detail and you give someone the opportunity, sometimes there are some evidence that they can present that was not available. And then the third standard is proportionality. The methods used must match the seriousness and evidential needs to the matter. And then the last thing I want to mention is just timeliness. Timeliness, especially in the case study, Rutendo, that you shared. It went on for a really long time, and it's fundamental to ensure that it's timely. It's not dragging on. The investigation is not going too deep. There's a real purpose for it, and we respect the individual, the subject of concern. Rutendo?
Thank you so much for that response, Vinny. I think, what you've laid out is in terms of, it's not a confirmation of guilt or anything. It's really trying to find what the truth is. It's about applying fair standards, and also, what could be the level of seriousness that would have been applied, and that is being investigated. But I guess one of the questions that I ask myself, especially when we are reviewing the case study that we are referring to, is, within those 13 years, from an investigator and from a forensics perspective, what the investigators are doing is obviously trying to find the truth, and it's dragging on. And one of the outcomes of such an investigation was the fact that it is an acquittal. And so I would then wonder, at that point, from a legal perspective, should we be worried about the language of acquittal, withdrawal of charges, and not just to the case studies that we are discussing, but in general when we are looking at these forensic kind of investigations? And perhaps here Aisha could give us some insight into how how we should be looking at the language or the messaging used by the law, things like acquittal, withdrawal of charges, or close of an investigation, and how come that does not automatically restore a person's or an organization's reputation. Thank you, Aisha.
Thank you, Rutendo. So we've had some quite recent cases in Kenya which bring out this point. Recently, a former senator for Uasin Gishu County, Mr. Mandago, has just been acquitted with some co-suspects of a scam where monies were fraudulently obtained from parents and students in exchange for promises of higher education in Finland. And a lot of money was donated, not really donated, given by these parents in good faith, and the higher education opportunities never materialized. Quite a lot of money was spent. Now, after quite a long period of criminal prosecution, and over 130 witnesses of fact gave evidence, the trial court said that the prosecution had not met the legal threshold. They had not made a prima facie case, and therefore all the suspects were acquitted. Now, it leaves a lot of questions unanswered for us as Kenyans, because the acquittal, the fact that the legal threshold was not met, could have two potential answers. One is that the prosecution did a shoddy job, potentially deliberately, in order to scupper a conviction, or that the suspects were actually scapegoats. They were convenient political scapegoats for a scandal which the government of the day wanted to show as if measures are being taken, and that the real culprits remain as they do today. We have not found the real culprits. The criminal process did not give us the culprits, and there's no other suggestion that something will be done. And this is a very prime example of why being acquitted may not in itself restore your original reputation. because questions remain in our minds as the general public, and large sums of money were spent, and there are so many victims whose money who lost money. So I think this is just a very live example. I can speak about other examples, but I think the issue with the criminal process or the civil process, when you go to court, the test is fairly narrow. So the test is, in a criminal case, it's beyond reasonable doubt. Now, there may be evidence which in the general public's mind is suggests impropriety or misconduct, and yet in the mind of a trial court is not sufficient to meet the legal test. That is not the same as saying you've been exonerated. There's a court of public opinion and there's a court of law. And normally the court of public opinion is much faster. It moves quickly. Everything moves instantaneously on social media. So your reputation is made or shattered within even minutes. And then you're told maybe 7 years down the line, 10 years down the line, oh, the legal process has resulted in a acquittal or a conviction. And you can see that the mismatch of timing and the fact that the legal process actually targets a much more narrower set of facts and a legal test, which is different to the court of public opinion, which is really a broader question of what happened in this case. And this person who was in charge, why are they not answerable? Somebody must be answerable. And we can't have a situation where we have victims and everyone is allowed to go scot-free. So I think, often I am sympathetic when people are reading excerpts of decisions from court and they're struggling to understand what did the court actually do and why has it not satisfied us as the general public. The court's mandate is far narrower. It's limited to specific charges that are framed, and they're not often necessarily understood or translate to real life experience. The court of public opinion is wider. Everyone gets to chip in. Everyone has a say. You get to have your own vote. And to that extent, it is a completely different process. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha, for bringing up those very strong issues on accountability. And particularly because, we understand obviously with the public, and especially if there has been a grievance, someone wants to see someone basically being hanged at the docks. And so my question now is to Moses, which is if such a matter were to spill over across jurisdictions and across borders, exactly, how should we be thinking about it? One of the issues that Aisha raised was, some standard tests that the courts ask for when they're looking at a particular case and the evidence brought before the court. And when this spills over across jurisdictions, what should we be knowing about these particular kinds of investigations?
First of all, I just wanted to comment on investigations in general. Typically, an investigation where reputations are concerned could be an official investigation, for example, that gives rise to some form of impeachment of a reputation. Say, for example, if you're in a public office and you're accused of, misfeasance in office, in whichever form, that could give rise to a public investigation. Now, one of the very important aspects of a public investigation is that the investigators largely are protected either constitutionally or by some statute in as far as the manner in which an investigation takes place. For example, just looking at the Nigerian case, that it was initiated by Nigerian authorities and it subsequently was prosecuted in the UK. Indeed, there were certain investigations that took place in the UK prior to her acquittal of those particular charges. Now, there is a lot of difficulty where the prosecution, where the investigation is initiated by way of a public form of investigation, because of those protections that I've just referred to. However, if it is a private complaint, say, for example, an organization, a non-governmental organization, or some form of multinational corporation, where such an investigation takes place, then the protections in law still shield the public officials from any consequences arising from their investigations, but does not necessarily shield the complainant. For example, if it's a multinational corporation, making a complaint about misfeasance of one of their employees, and thereafter there's an investigation by a public body which leads to an acquittal. There are many instances where, if that investigation was unfair or perhaps was conducted in a manner that impeaches the reputation of the person under investigation, there could be liability visited on the organization that initiated the investigation or indeed made the initial complaint. Now, where in the case where my sister Aisha has just been speaking about, where there's an acquittal, some of the things that we do as private lawyers is to look very carefully at the manner in which the investigation took place. Was it fair? Was due process observed? Was there objectivity in the manner in which the investigation took place? And if not, there are particular remedies we look at. For example, we could start an action for malicious prosecution. Indeed, in Uganda, quite recently, there was a huge award for an employee, a former employee of a large, I don't want to say which company it is, but it's in the public record and public domain, a large telecommunications company that initiated an investigation against a former employee. And in this particular instance, the former employee got over 700,000 US dollars by way of compensation arising from what was deemed to be a malicious prosecution. In that particular case, there was a report that was commissioned by a private investigator. And that particular individual was exonerated in the report, but nonetheless, the organization went ahead to have him prosecuted, and that was a result. Now, where there's cross-border, where there are cross-border issues, I think that as a lawyer, one ought to do two or three things. The first thing one ought to do, obviously, is to ensure that the investigators in that particular jurisdiction are cautioned about ongoing proceedings in the primary jurisdiction. That's a first step, because if in most cases a prosecutor or an investigator in another jurisdiction would normally await the outcome of an investigation in the primary jurisdiction before taking steps. Secondly, is the question of evidence. Most of the evidence that will be gathered in the primary jurisdiction. So again, the prosecutor or investigator in the secondary jurisdiction must be cautioned about the fact that the evidential burdens that have just been spoken about, certainly at law, are much, much higher than in the public opinion. So caution ought to be exercised. Thirdly, of course, and I suppose we shall be speaking about this a little later on, there's a whole issue about media, social media. How far does this investigation extend? To what extent has it been publicized? What sort of remedies can we have recourse to in those sorts of circumstances? I think these are things that we shall traverse later on in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moses. I have so many questions. Particularly also to Vili, because I guess you're the one answerable to all of the investigators, right? But before I come back to you, especially on the issue of the standards applied in law and whether there's some ethical standards that should be applied, I'm coming right back to you. In the meantime, I actually want to go to Nikita, because in some of the issues that yourself, Aisha and Moses have raised, it seems that there's a bridge that needs to be drawn between, the legal timeline and the reputational timeline. And the question that I have is, how do we bridge that gap, especially from the perspective of the person concerned, from the minute that, the investigation is beginning? Moses raised points about there are questions you ask, was it fair? Was it approached objectively? And all of these things. And all of that can be applied technically, but when we're dealing with the court of public and when we're dealing with the business of people, how then do we actually start to reconcile all of those standards in a way that at least by the time you get what the outcome is, what your next steps are as an organization? This is, of course, bearing in mind that, if you're guilty, you're guilty. I mean, there's nothing that we can do about it. But yeah, Nikita, over to you.
Thanks for the question, Rutendo, and thanks everyone else for your comments. So what I want to start off with is just kind of bringing us into the reality of what public relations and a communication strategy can actually achieve. Because, you know, as you've all mentioned, the public tend to think there is no smoke without fire, even if you're completely innocent. And so it does require a lot of work, a lot of effort, and patience, as frustrating as that might be, to be able to recover your reputation once, you know, big allegations of, you know, malfeasance have been made. But I do just want to bring us back a few little steps, because there are specific things, especially within organizations, that can be done to really try to damage control before it becomes a full-on, you know, viral reputational issue. And one of the things, of course, is what Vili was mentioning at the beginning in relation to investigations. You know, how did the process of requesting an investigation come about? Well, probably through some sort of whistleblower line. You know, maybe a journalist was in touch beforehand and said, hey, I've been approached by someone within your organization who has given me these allegations. What is your response to them? So ideally, the first time that you are finding out about an allegation is not through the press. And so you should already be in reputation management mode before anything becomes public, because that is your best defense. And so in that situation where, for example, you might have been approached, let's say, I don't know, you're an NGO and you've been approached by a journalist who said, hi, that, you know, one of your employees has made allegations of sexual harassment at this project that you run. You're not waiting for the story to go public before you're responding to it. So there are steps that you should be taking immediately in that moment, which will then help you manage your reputation further down the line. So one of those, for example, would be to go and begin an independent investigation company to come and do the investigation. Because if it is the first time you're hearing about it, you want to show that you did act immediately. Unfortunately, I have been involved in cases where the allegations were known about prior to a journalist getting in touch, but action only took place once a journalist got in touch. And so the reason I bring that up is because it is very important to actually, so you've got these structures in place, you've got a whistleblower line in place, but if you're just ignoring the complaints that you're receiving through the whistleblower line, then your reputation is going to be damaged, because it shows that actually those were just box ticking exercises and you weren't doing the right things. So it's whenever an organization takes a decision, think about how, if this were to get public, how would I look publicly based on the way that I acted in this moment? So I think really important to act immediately, because if you show action, your public statements, once something does become public, if it does, can then focus on that and say, actually, you know, mistakes happen, issues happen, but we acted in the best way possible as soon as we were made aware of them. You can't control everyone's actions, but what you can control is how you react to them. And so I think all of the reputation management actually needs to start long before something is leaked to the press. The other reason I bring that up is because often, if you don't react to something that has been brought up through a whistleblower complaint, then the whistleblower is likely to feel like they're not being heard, and then they will go to the press. So that is how the leak occurs. So it's very, very important to react to all these kinds of complaints as soon as they come through. once, once something has been made public, or rather, once a journalist has been in touch, then there are, of course, ways that you can interact with the journalist, statements you can make, and so on, that will try to damage control as much as possible. One thing I always try to remind clients is that the role of someone like me is not to completely kill the story, although obviously that would be wonderful. But it is to buy the organization some time to get their ducks in a row, begin an investigation, understand what is actually happening before the story is printed. And so one of the things I always advise is to actually interact with the journalists. Don't just ignore them. And if you're scared of how to interact with them, get someone like myself or one of my colleagues, Abel, and so on, to do it for you, because we know how to interact with journalists. We know the things to do and to say in order to get you a bit more time. So a journalist should ideally give at least 24 to 48 hours to respond to something. But if you are able to interact with them, you can buy yourself a week, 10 days, 2 weeks before they actually go to press. And in that time, you can do a lot of work to manage your reputation. The other point I want to make just very quickly, because I know there's a lot of things going on and I could talk about this for hours, is it's really, really important not to just think about the public and how they will react to something, but to think about your employees, your donors, your other stakeholders, suppliers, if you're a manufacturer, your customers, all of that kind of thing. So you want to be thinking about how you are going to inform them as well as the public. So stakeholder management is really, really important as well during a crisis reputational moment. And within that, going back to the point I made earlier, even though you ideally don't know who the whistleblower is, if your whistleblowing lines are working properly, you want to assume anyone could be the whistleblower, and you want to manage their expectations. So you want to make it known as much as possible that the complaint has been taken on board and that action is taking place, so that they then don't feel that they have to go to the press and leak it. One of the things, especially if it's a really big allegation that involves several people in the company, is to hold some kind of a town hall, especially if there's going to be a public story about it, so that everyone hears it from you and you are in charge of the messaging rather than from the media. I will stop there because I could say many more things, and I think there's a lot of other bits to get through. But yeah, manage your reputation quickly, not 13 years later.
Well, but Nikita, that's specifically the question that I'm actually about to raise, because, if we're looking at the case of Alison, for example, right, the story is now 13 years later that she's talking about her reputation being damaged. And I'm sure there are many organizations and people who start discussing their story and their journey after the fact. And there's also the issue of, the words and the language that was used. And one of the points that Aisha raised around acquittal, withdrawal, exonerated. So let's say I'm an organization and oops, I didn't call you until 13 years later, and now they've acquitted me or they've withdrawn the charges, but they've not exonerated me. Now what? What exactly do I do in that situation?
So I actually think what she is doing is exactly what I would advise, because I mean, she got a very prominent article on the BBC saying how her reputation has been damaged. So you want to own the narrative. You want to own the situation, because already, as soon as I saw that, I was like, oh, okay, she was innocent in the end. Obviously you can't turn back time. So, I think there's a slight problem with this particular case because it was obviously political. There was obviously, a reason that it lasted for so long. There's no way it should have lasted for 13 years. I'm sure the investigators in the UK were really struggling to get evidence from Nigeria and all these kinds of things. So I think this is a particularly difficult case because there was a reason that it was made to last as long as it did. I don't think it is normal for these kinds of investigations to last this long. And of course, and I think this is again for the lawyers and Villy and so on, there are limits legally to what you can do and say in the midst of an investigation. And that's actually something that I often have to, argue with the lawyers about, because I'm like, yeah, let's go all guns blazing and say, they're innocent and all the rest of it. But it's like, hang on, we can't actually do that. So you're right. The language that you use, how you approach the media, those are all things that will they're not going to completely fix your reputation in the midst of the investigation, but there are ways that you can reduce the damage to be so severe. And again, another thing that can happen is you yourself don't have to be the only one speaking about this. So you can always get third parties that are independent to be giving their opinion publicly on this in a way that doesn't seem as though it is affecting the outcome, but which will, in the end, assist you with your reputational management. But it's not a magic wand. And unfortunately, it is a reality. It is a reality of this day and age that, reputations are built and shattered by a tweet. Unfortunately, that can happen. And so it's how you manage that will really be the test of whether your reputation rebuilds. And it's not going to happen overnight. Again, really important that you are patient.
So in the same breath, and I want to come to Moses just after I speak to Vinny, because I'm really interested in the legal remedies. I think a lot of the points that Nikita has touched on is how do we approach the public face, and when we use some of the legal remedies you mentioned, like the case on the action for malicious damage, does that actually solve the problem, or at least in the financial sense, it makes the heart feel a little bit better. So I want you to be thinking about that as I come to you. But Villy, I think we've heard a lot. I mean, one of the points that Nikita has raised is the fact that sometimes an investigation doesn't need to drag out for this long, right? And sometimes it just does. That's what the situation is. And when investigators begin an investigation or in the midst of an investigation, beyond the legal standards that they have to follow and apply within an investigation, what other considerations should investigators be having, especially maybe they are junior or they're working across jurisdictions and they are working with multiple organizations and social contexts? If you were speaking to a room full of them now, what are some things in your own experience that you've said, actually, here is what we should be doing, and let's not completely ruin somebody's life, especially if we're in pursuit of the truth?
Thanks, Rutendo. Let me speak a little bit about investigations in general. I'm a firm believer that failing to plan is planning to fail. And this is very true for investigations. Moses referred to a couple of things. Aisha referred to a couple of things. And all of these things actually are the fundamental things that you should consider before you start an investigation. Nikita just said that it's difficult to react. And I totally agree, because if you plan, then you're potentially going to think about all these things and all the risks, all the things that might go wrong. You can actually think about it and plan it at the beginning. So the first thing for me is proper planning. So everything that we discussed up to now, each and every risk, reputation, media, reporting, objectives, what's the objective of the deliverable, where are we going with this, how are we going to help this organization, are we going to do it confidentially, can we keep it confidential? All these aspects are things that that you actually can include in a planning phase upfront. If your junior resources and investigators are part of these sessions, that is where you discuss if something goes wrong, this is how we escalate. This is when we get Moses and Aisha involved, or maybe we get them involved from day one because we've seen a specific risk. You go to the extent where you have a detailed action plan. You even plan how you're actually going to interview individuals. Who are you going to interview? The order of the interviews. So there's a lot of very detailed planning that actually has to happen way up front to make sure that we're in control of the investigation and to Nikita's point of the narrative. I've been involved in investigations in my life that went horribly wrong. And it is so distractive when reports are leaking, when your reports are in the media, to actually get teams to focus on finishing and completing the investigation. So planning is key. I'll very quickly run through the other phases of an investigation. The second phase normally relates to how do we secure the evidence, potential evidence, intelligence, and the like. How do we secure that? Whether it's electronic, whether it's in paper format, doesn't matter what format. We then normally go into a phase where we analyze everything, building timelines, understand what happened, evaluate and validate the evidence. We do interviews, and like I said, there are definitely some work to do around that in terms of planning. Make sure you do it at the right time, in a certain order. There are certain processes that has to be followed. And then eventually we give the subjects of concern the opportunity to respond to some of the allegations. I mentioned that before. And then the last thing is actually how do we report? Now, in some of the cases that we're working on, we do full forensic reports and we really manage the distribution of deliverables and reports very tightly. It goes to a specific people. It is not open in the open. So that's also something that we manage really closely. In terms of timing, Rutendo, I mean, I haven't been involved in an investigation of 13 years, but I think the investigations we're getting involved in, there's at the planning phase, one will understand more or less how long it will take you. If it's a big corporate failure, the one that was mentioned recently, Steinhoff, was a corporate failure, and the investigation went on for 12 to 18 months. That for me is a really long investigation. In my view, the investigations and the timeliness is key because management, the boards, the decision makers are under pressure to make decisions quick and fast. And there must be a process through which management, the investigative team, and the decision makers can do reviews in terms of, is it still necessary to continue with investigations? Why is it taking so long? Is that the indication of a lack of evidence, for instance, and the like? So I think timeliness is obviously very important. And I do think that management decision makers must visit or revisit on a constant basis to make sure that it's not dragging on. Maybe the last thing I wanted to say, Rutendo, is that although it's great to plan for all these things, what makes it more and more difficult these days is investigations are not coming to us through clients. It's coming to us through bloggers or newspaper articles. So it's out in the open, and then you almost have a team, an investigative team that's going to react to that. So it's already out in the open, reputations are already damaged, and then how do you actually help give confidence and credibility to this process?
That's helpful. Thank you so much, Billy. I mean, when you said lack of evidence, I was like, how would Nikita manage lack of evidence? How, when the outcome is there was a lack of evidence, where do we go from there? But I wanna come to Moses because of some of the legal remedies that he's mentioned, and without trying to demonize or you know make it seem like investigators are the bad guys or the good guys. I think one of the things you've mentioned really is that as much as you plan for the process as an investigator, reports can get leaked, things happen, people don't follow particular procedures as they're supposed to. So, at the end, if there's a favorable outcome, when we are now starting to think about recovering the reputation and recovering what was lost in those months or in those years, one of the points that Moses raised was, there are remedies such as the action for malicious intent. And I think Aisha can also come in here. What additional legal remedies are there? And are there also, some kind of remedies that bridge the investigator and the victim or slash survivor that's concerned? How from a legal perspective would we manage that kind of post disaster, if I can put it that way?
Thank you, Rutendo, for the question. First of all, I just want to re-echo what Vili has spoken about, the whole point about organization. When you start an investigation, it's really important to be very clear about the specific objectives that you have for that investigation. Because typically, if you do not have a narrow scope, investigations just spiral out of control and all sorts of other things that perhaps were, incipient come to the fore. So if you're looking at it from an organization perspective, we must be very clear about what is it that we want to achieve. After you determine what it is you want to achieve, you must be very clear about whom do you want investigated. And I'll come to why that's important later on. Because, for example, if a whistleblower has come forward with a complaint, and then thereafter you then decide you're also going to investigate the whistleblower, then you have to be very cautious. And I'll explain why a little later on in my intervention. And the third thing, of course, is what evidence do you want looked at or examined? An organization has to be very clear before even calling in an investigator. How does it preserve the evidence? Is it on a computer, for example? Must you sequestrate the computer or the disks, or is it online? For example, was it merely an allegation online? Do you really want to investigate an allegation which was merely made online? Can you, for example, have an own investigation done by an internal auditor to determine whether or not it is credible? These are some of the things that an organization must think about. Now, that's speaking from an organizational perspective. Now, let's look at it from the perspective of a victim of an investigation, perhaps somebody who has been implicated and exonerated subsequently. In this particular case I referred to, a whistleblower came forward about a huge loss, a huge fraud in that particular organization. Many millions of dollars, I think $4 or $5 million fraud. Whistle blew, an investigation was carried out, independent investigation was carried out. This particular individual was exonerated. Thereafter, this particular individual left the company, went and formed a different company in competition with his former employee. A year later, after the investigations had been completed, he had been exonerated, the organization then decided to have the police come in and start criminal proceedings against various people implicated in the investigation, plus the whistleblower. Now, and clearly he had been exonerated in the first report. In fact, he was cited, with plaudits that he'd done very well to make the report. And he was subsequently, during the course of this particular prosecution, evidence was obtained that was improperly obtained through coercion and other means. And in the judgment where this gentleman was being prosecuted in the criminal prosecution, he was exonerated and, in fact, acquitted of the charges. Now, at that point, you have been exonerated of the charges. Now, I'm speaking from an individual's perspective involved in an investigation. You've been exonerated of charges, but you see, it doesn't stop there because, for example, if I work in a financial institution typically, certainly in our jurisdiction, you have to be found fit and proper. There are certain roles or responsibilities in financial organizations that require central bank approval. This particular individual had a circular had gone out to say he's not fit and proper to carry out particular roles in financial institutions. Now, if that has been your career, what do you do? So do you want at that point, for example, to go to the corporation and tell them, look, I want a very big public apology in the newspaper, basically pointing out that I've been exonerated, my reputation has been cleared, you were in the wrong, and if you don't do so, these are the consequences for you. Because then the next point would be, do I go and start a malicious prosecution action against the organization that initiated these proceedings that led to my prosecution and subsequent exoneration? And usually our courts in those sorts of situations will award huge general damages, as I pointed out. They will award perhaps aggravated damages, huge amounts as well. And if, for example, you had not completed where in the middle of your contract, they may award damages for the full lifespan of the particular contract. One other thing that I would like also to mention is that where you have an investigation being launched, an organization has to be very careful about who has access to the nature of this investigation. They must, as much as possible, try and keep it confidential. Because in the event that this goes out, say, for example, on social media, and individuals are implicated, X, Y, and Z, are said to have been involved in, malfeasance of whatever form, financial or other forms of malfeasance, and they are subsequently exonerated, there could be a case for defamation proceedings, both against the individuals and indeed against the social media, the people who put it onto social media. And we have seen this in Uganda recently, where a member of a management team put out certain information about an investigation, and the information that was put out was found to be lewd and perhaps even rather sensational. And in this particular case, the court found the person who put out that information on social media liable, and that particular individual was ordered to pay about $30,000 in damages for defaming a person who was subsequently exonerated in an investigation. So there are many aspects to an investigation, the outcome of an investigation, the manner in which evidence is preserved, who is privy to the investigation, how is the investigation managed, and most important of all, what outcomes are we looking for? In the case of NGOs, do you really want to have an investigation? Where we know, for example, that the implications could be very far-reaching on a reputation. Careful thought has to be given to these issues. Thank you, Rutendo.
I like that you have a way of bringing me towards the next part of my conversation, and what I'm about to do. We have a question from the audience, which we're going to address first, and then from there, I want to start speaking about the recovery of the reputation and the process thereafter, right? I think we've spoken quite a bit on managing the situation, what the remedies are available, and so I'm quite interested in starting to know the relationship that legal advisors and communications advisors can have towards the restoring or the recovery of a reputation. And I'll hear from Nikita and Aisha, and then understanding what the, one of the issues that Billy raised was sometimes reports get leaked. And so there's an aspect of managing the information in a way that is faithful to the investigation. And that will be between Nikita and Billy for that. So as you are thinking through your responses, I think let's take a question from the audience, which is, if someone is investigated publicly and later cleared of wrongdoing, who is responsible for repairing the damage to their reputation?
I can take that. They are, unfortunately, the burden lies on them, because, no one else is going to do it, and no one else is going to do it as well as them. And this brings me back to what I'm always advising clients is that if you're not speaking about yourself, and someone else is speaking about you, what they are saying is wrong. And it's not what you want out there. So you yourself have to be leading that. Now, you have to be leading that. If you don't want to be the one speaking, there are other ways of doing this. And this is what I was saying about having third-party voices involved, because sometimes people tend to think that, of course, you yourself are going to defend yourself. Of course you are. But if someone else is defending you, oh, okay, maybe there's some truth that they are innocent and all the rest of it. And so there are ways that us in PR can help you to kind of find the right people to speak publicly on your behalf, write opinion pieces, do interviews, all this kind of thing. These are all, weapons in our arsenal, basically, that we can use to reset your reputation. But you are the one that has to be leading the narrative on this. If someone else is doing it, it's not going to help you in the long term. And this includes things like, making sure that the messages that everyone is saying are the same message. It can be said in a different way, but the baseline needs to be the same. So, if you're an organization and you have different, leadership roles and all the rest of it, what they're saying has to be the same as what, say you're a manufacturer and you have, a shop. If a shop assistant gets asked by a member of the public, oh, I heard this really terrible thing about you as an organization, what do you have to say about it? The person in the shop needs to be able to say the same things, maybe not in the same sophisticated way, but they need to be saying the same things as what the senior leadership is doing. And so all of the messaging, all of the way that you are doing the communication, all needs to be aligned, and it all needs to come from you. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And the message will get diluted along the way, and it will get mistold, and in the end, it won't be the message that you want out there. So it's really, really important that you yourself are leading on the reputation management of yourself.
Suppose I want to ask a quick follow-up to that. I think one of the various remedies that Moses has raised, right? In a way, they speak to the point you've made about having different ways to speak for yourself, and that legal aspect definitely does speak for you, right? Especially if you're going to get $700,000. I mean, nothing says, I didn't do anything wrong than $700,000. But and from a communications perspective, how do you manage those various ways and approaches to recover your reputation in a way that doesn't seem vindictive? I think one of the things that Moses was talking about, especially the person who ended up starting their own competitive company, it can appear vindictive and political and make it particularly harder for the investigators to even know where they're beginning and where they're ending. So what are some of your thoughts about that?
It's a good question. I always think, and this is kind of what Vili was and Moses was saying about investigations, the reaction needs to be proportional to the allegation. And it's the same with your communication strategy. How serious was the allegation? Were you accused of extreme human rights abuses of your workers as a farm? Or was it, malpractice, financial fraud and malpractice? Those are, of course, both very serious things. But the public's reaction to the human rights abuses will be significantly stronger than to financial fraud and malpractice. So you need to measure your response based on what the allegation is. When it comes to something like the human rights abuses, and this kind of answers the question that I think you were going to ask me later anyway, so I'll just do it now. It's really, really important that you kind of, you have to ask yourself, why was this allegation made against us? Is this something to do within the company culture? Like, do we have a toxic work environment? What is happening here? Because if the investigation happened and there was no evidence and all the rest of it, and everyone's free, well, why was this allegation made? So you don't want to immediately come out all guns blazing and say, see, we told you so, this is all rubbish, there's no human rights abuses here, we're completely the best organization to work for, and all the rest of it, because that's not actually going to help you recover your reputation. You want to do, firstly, an internal HR review. It kind of needs to be all encompassing, right? Like, why was this allegation leaked? Why was it made public? Maybe it was a malicious allegation. Maybe we've got a competitor who's trying to slander us. What's happening here? And then based on that, then you can tailor your response, your public response to it. Because you do need to be, as tempting as it is to just kind of, go all out and say how wonderful you are and all the rest of it, you need to think about, what is the public thinking about me? So sometimes it's okay to take a little bit of a reputational hit for a short period whilst you work that out, and then you can build up on that later and have the right messaging, have the right statements. And I think one of the important points I really wanted to make is that, which kind of goes to what the question was that the audience member asked, is you really need to own the issue even after the reputational crisis has passed. So don't just pretend that it never happened for the rest of the organization's history. Use it as a learning opportunity. Use it as a moment that you refer back to. How did we build back from this as an organization? How did we use this to our advantage to learn what was happening on the ground? Why did we miss this in the first place? So kind of use that in your messaging and refer back to it. Make sure you keep your public statements up on your website. Don't just delete them. If you had them on social media, make sure that they're there so that people can continue to go back to them and hear your voice on the matter even after the crisis moment has passed. Because it's really, really important that you don't just pretend that it never happened. One of the pieces of advice I give to clients is that the way you measure if your reputation has recovered is not that everyone has just forgotten that there was an issue, but rather that they remember how well you dealt with it. That's, I think, the true test of reputational recovery, is that they think, okay, they went through this issue, but they handled it really well, and I actually still really respect them as an organization. So I think that's the kind of distinction that you want to make. And then there are a few, specific PR things that can happen, which is, after enough time has passed, invite journalists, have interviews, get them to start writing good stories about you so that the Google search results move the negative stories down the page. These are all the kinds of actions that you can take. But again, they're not going to happen overnight. To change the Google search page, it's going to be a couple of months. So you need to be thinking in the long term when it comes to reputational recovery, and owning it. Own it when it happens.
Thank you so much, Nikita. I think that's very helpful. I mean, onto the point of, managing the response, don't go nuclear if all you need is a slap on the wrist. And I want to bring in Aisha here, because Aisha has quite a lot of experience in things like alternative dispute resolution. And so, as a trusted advisor, Aisha, in disputes and in litigation, I'm your client. I come and I'm angry and I'm like, let's sue, let's do all of these things. I'm very, very upset, and I've heard what Nikita has said, but I want to take all of the legal responses, that are available to me. So, what are some some pieces of advice you would give a client in that particular situation? And in response to a point you raised about perhaps there's a miscommunication in the legal judgment, how do you help them communicate the legal, outcome in a way to the public where there's no real reason to take legal action that burns the ground completely, without obviously taking away from the fact that sometimes it is what it is and that's what needs to be done?
I think the situation is very different for individuals and corporates. Generally, my approach, which I think maybe Moses might share, is that corporates may not do well bringing defamation claims, because bringing defamation claims, especially against bloggers and individuals, keeps the story alive for longer and almost validates the allegation, because there's usually an imbalance of power. And if you have this blogger who's notorious, they never fact check, we all know they're paid to plant stories. When a corporate with a credible brand responds with legal action, they're almost elevating that allegation to one that, I can understand if the New York Times publishes something against Donald Trump, President Trump always takes legal action. He's notorious. But that's the New York Times, and it's a credible newspaper, and it has a wide reach. When you take like a Kenya blogger, you cannot place them on the same platform as maybe the Daily Nation or a credible paper. So I think that for corporates, often it may not make any sense to bring a defamation case, and that the other tactics that Nikita was suggesting, calling in journalists, putting out good news stories, focusing perhaps on their social impact, there are other things that corporates do which maybe can be amplified. That might be a better approach. If you're an individual, you may have to take legal action, not because you're necessarily expecting very much out of the court process, but only to be able to sort of bolster so for example, politicians often don't have a choice. Politicians are the most likely people to take legal action because usually they want to be able to tell their constituencies or voters that this was a complete pack of lies, and in fact, I'm going to punish these people who are my political enemies. And there are other considerations there. If you're a normal person in the corporate space, I'm not sure, again, you have to balance. What is it? Is it that, for example, you are not getting shortlisted for the types of maybe private sector jobs that you need to? And then you have to ask yourself whether the defamation case doesn't solve that issue. But I think you may have more leeway as an individual, and you may simply want, knowing that you will never get any money, because often the people you're suing, they will never pay you any money. Maybe the point is just to have a headline later that you can then refer to and say, I was vindicated. So for example, I've seen that recently there's an Australian Muslim politician I think there was some sort of ruling that the One Nation female politician had slandered her and in some sort of tweet, and then she appealed that, and the High Court has upheld the ruling. Now, that type of legal action, I can see it's very beneficial for the victim, because essentially it continues to keep the narrative alive that I am, a victim. I'm standing up for a particular constituency that is a minority, and this is part of their politician brand. So that makes a lot of sense. Whether it makes sense for somebody like me to bring a defamation case, I'm not sure. I always feel that people who bring these type of cases, they seem to have very thick skins, and they also seem sometimes to be continuously in the public limelight for very interesting reasons. So I always wonder, are they as sensitive as they appear? But nevertheless, all I'm highlighting is that the factors that you would consider are very different depending on if you're a corporate, if you're an individual. Even if you're an individual, are you in the public sector? You have a particular role. Are you a politician? Are you in the private sector? What works better for you? And those things, as opposed to the actual legal results and damages, may outweigh and be the reason you make a decision either yes or no. So there's no, generally I would say there's no one answer fits all.
Thank you so much, Aisha. I think also that that nicely ties the conversation on legal remedies and the conversation, the relationship you can share with communication advisors. And I just want to bring in Vili before we answer the question from the audience. From an investigator side, what information can responsibly be shared to reduce speculations and without compromising the investigation process and also the evidence that may be reached if you're in particularly just as an investigator, and if you were working, for instance, with someone like Nikita and Nikita's team.
Thanks, Rutendo. So I mean, we are very strict and follow due process when we release findings, reports, forensic reports, and the likes. I think there are two things. So that is the one aspect, and the other aspect I think is how can we empower someone like Nikita with enough information to deal with the reputational side of it. And I think that's where, again, I don't always go back to planning, but I think that's where you must foresee these things before it happens. And then have a multidisciplinary team from day one to ensure that the right information is shared within the right group of individuals and team members to make sure that we empower everybody to respond accordingly. And to be able to, at the end of the day, help a client or an organization to ensure that they can also protect their reputation. Maybe just the last thing in terms of reporting, and that's what I mentioned initially. We manage it really carefully. There are instances where Moses mentioned it earlier, where we're dealing with NGOs or donors. And there are different deliverables that we will share with different role players, where from time to time we'll take out the individuals' names and so on and so forth to make sure that we keep it confidential. So to answer your question, going back to understand it up front, make sure that we have a multidisciplinary team and really control how we release information and what we release.
Thanks, Vili. And the next question actually is to you from the audience. Vili mentioned that the primary goal of any investigation is to uncover the truth. However, investigations often take place in highly politicized environments where public narratives can influence the process. How can organizations ensure that investigations remain impartial? What safeguards can prevent political interests or bias from undermining both the pursuit of truth and the recovery of an organization's reputation? I mean, Vili, you've got your work cut out for you here, right?
So Retendo, this is actually an easy one because we deal with it quite often, and that's why I'm getting great quite a bit. We operate on the continent, and this is relevant all over our continent, from South Africa right through. I mean, all the countries we operating in, we from time to time find political pressures and people that are trying to influence the outcome. I think there are a couple of things that are critical. Firstly, and I said it way in the beginning, it's all about the reputation and the credibility of investigators. If your investigative team and the firm that's doing it is credible and they have the right commitment, I think you are 50% there. Then I think there are very specific things that we put in place to ensure that we manage this. So there will be a second or a third partner involved in managing a specific investigation. And this is very relevant and easy for a firm like us, because I normally get Aisha or a lawyer involved to make sure that they help managing some of that. And then we focus on an independent, objective investigation with our factual findings. There are other ways to do it to limit information to team members. So someone will only have a very limited knowledge of a certain specific aspect of the investigation. So you'll keep the investigation almost fragmented with only the leaders really understanding what is going on in the investigation. It's another way of managing that from our point of view. So it happens often. I don't think it's a big problem for us anyway. I think that we managing it proactively, and also I think it's all about your reputation. If people know that ALN is doing something specific, I know they know what the outcome will be. There's no way that they will influence the outcome of an investigation.
Really, I think that audience member is going to be your favorite person today. The way you're like lighting up. What's your favorite question? Thanks a lot for that response. I think we are running out of time, and it's time to wrap up. And so I just want to find out from our audience members if anything that the audience should take away today. What's one or two things that you would like them to know and take away and take very seriously? And we'll start with. Sorry, Aisha. If there's one thing that the audience should know and take away today, what is it that they should take very seriously?
I think the most important thing is that your reputation is an unquantifiable asset. Because you can't quantify it, it is probably amongst your most valuable. Things that you can count, normally you can replace. Unfortunately, we are learning time and again, reputations are very hard to repair. If that is the case, I feel that organizations may not be spending the amount required to properly protect reputations when faced with allegations. They may not be making the resource allocations required that would support the protection of a vital or critical asset. In the same way, you might have an industrial or trade secret, and you would take enormous steps to fund the protection of that, the theft, the recovery. I think that is the approach I would like to see more organizations taking when faced with maybe whistleblower allegations or any other allegations that surface. I think my own experience is that often it takes them time to give priority and to give an allegation perhaps the attention it deserves if we look at it from that mindset. So my parting shot is cheap is expensive.
Aisha, you couldn't have said it more succinctly, and I think Nikita, I could tell her saying, "Go Aisha, go Aisha, go Aisha." So, Billy, if you want anything, what would those final takeaways be?
I'll be very quick. I just think that surround yourself with the right professionals, people that's done this before. I think that is critical.
Thanks, Billy. I think one of the important points that you raised was, having a multidisciplinary team, and I'm sure that's a significant part of it. And to you, Moses.
Well, just to thank the audience for staying with us. I think the most important thing is that you must coordinate your legal and communication responses to any investigation, and to bear in mind that falsehood takes the elevator and the truth takes the stairs. So it's critical that the investigation process or the outcome of an investigation process is well managed. Thank you.
The ALN Academy's comms team is very excited because of some of the quotable moments that we've had here. I mean, Aisha, is cheap is expensive. When the falsehood takes the elevator and the truth takes the stairs, our comms team is very, very excited with all of these bites that we'll be taking from now on. So thank you for that very much. Nikita, I think everybody's kind of, said all of the stuff that makes you very, very happy to hear. You've done a fantastic job. But what are some things that we should be taking away from this session?
Yeah, I'm just going to repeat a couple of things that everyone has said. The first one is get the comms team in right away. Don't be scared of the comms team. Just because you've got a PR team involved doesn't mean that they're going to go out and promote things. Part of the work of a PR team is actually to stop things from being reported. So get the comms team in right away. And then the other thing is kind of back to what Villy's been saying throughout is plan. Do you have a crisis PR plan in place before a crisis hits? Because you don't want to be scrambling around when the crisis moment is there. And so, yeah, think about your crisis PR readiness in advance.
So thank you so much, Nikita. But I think, to support that as well from what Aisha said is, put your money aside. Nikita's team does a great job and not cheap. So start putting all those resources aside, guys. Thank you so much to our audience for attending today's webinar. I think we've learned a lot. I've certainly learned a lot. So I know I'm in the right hands. But also to ALN Kenya and ALN Uganda, as well as to Adili. But really, really appreciative of the time that you've spent with us today. As a timekeeper and a disciplinarian, I'm very, very excited. We've kept to time. We've said all of the things that need to be said. But if there are any other questions, please feel free to hit us up on our social media pages for the ALN Academy, Adili Group, ALN, and just hear, what tips and advice you could be giving, that you could be getting for your organization. And, stay tuned for the next webinar. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Rutendo. Great.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Thanks.